Can you hear me?
I can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, look, I'm delighted to be here. I'm happier than Helen Thomas at a Hamas rally. I'm happier than Joe Biden on Lime Jello Day at the home. If you may have noticed that I've been sweating like a fat man at all you eat pasta bar, it's because I took a cab straight from the airport to Portillo's. I got the big beef sandwich dipped with hot peppers and cheese, and then I walked mostly here, and then I smoked a cigar. So I'm kind of like on a vision quest. So I'll try to keep it coherent. I'm deeply chagrined because Iowa was supposed to be here. Those of you who don't know who he is, he's a hilarious blogger, unless he's here in Mufti, sort of hiding in the sky. It was like one of the first times my wife actually was impressed with anything I'm doing, which you heard that Iowa was going to be in the audience. That's something I was doing. But then I found out when I got here that Iowa actually doesn't live in Iowa. Which is just, I think that's a scandal. That's like finding out Elizabeth Warren's not an Indian. That the Cherokee don't actually eat a lot of crab. I thought it'd be a great sort of like Quest for Fire kind of movie about like the Plains Indians in the 1700s searching for crab because like, the ocean's only like 700 miles away. So anyway, like, even though David Burge, that's his real name, look him up in the phone book. If you know where he lives, leave a burning pile of Paul Krugman's columns in a paper bag outside the door. But I'm delighted you guys can make it because you guys are more important than he is anyway, rat bastard. So, yeah, I got a new book out. It's called The Tyranny of Cliches. Those of you who've read it will probably guess it was a lot more fun to write than liberal fascism was. My first book, you only write your first book once, and I wanted it to be a serious book, and I had this big thing I want to get off my chest that frustrated me so much. This whole idea that everybody I sort of revered was a fascist because they believed in free markets and limited government. And it was always a very confusing thing for me. People like William F. Buckley, or like people who believed in the things that my dad was teaching me were always called fascists and Nazis. And even before I did a deep dive into the academic literature, I was always sort of confused because there weren't a lot of Nazi Goldbergs. And so one of the reasons why I wrote liberal fascism was I would go on college campuses all the time, and these kids would say, I'd be talking about tax cuts, and they'd be calling me a fascist. And, it was usually some kid, with open-toed shoes and a closed mind. And I always love to ask him, I always say, hey, can I ask you a question? Except for the murder, bigotry, genocide, and war, what was it exactly about Nazism you don't like? And they would sort of look at me with that same expression that my basset hound used to look at me with when I tried to feed it a grape. Total unblinking incomprehension. And so then I would explain to them that the Nazi National Socialists were socialists. Anyway, so it was in part because of my experience going around the country talking about liberal fascism that it gave me the idea to write this next book. Because one of the things I really discovered was that while fascism was the big cliche that sort of was the linchpin of what a lot of kids in colleges are taught, the reality is that kids in colleges are simply indoctrinated with a whole slew of cliches, right? And I don't mean cliches in like buzz phrases or bumper stickers or that kind of stuff, avoid cliches like the plague. The thing is not like a writing guide or anything like that. It's ways of thinking, right? And so I would go on college campuses and I'd be talking about national defense, right? And I would say I think that national defense, we need a strong national defense to protect the sea lanes, protect trade, protect our place in the world, the usual sort of Reaganite position, because I'm a Reaganite. And these kids would say, that sounds like a really ideological statement. Yeah, it's an ideological statement. I'm an ideological guy, and that's part of my ideology. And then they would say, and besides, I just think violence never solved it. And it slowly dawned on me that these kids are taught these things as ways to sort of like these placeholders in their brains to skip the hard thinking, right? You don't have to do the math. There's sort of these algorithms that lead them to conclusions without actually having to work out the problem. And it turns out one of the things that I spent a lot of time on in liberal fascism was the history of American pragmatism. And I don't mean practicality, right? When I say pragmatism, I'm talking about a philosophical school. I don't mean like the great practical good sense of Americans who, like MacGyver, know how to take a piece of chewing gum and some tinfoil and make a nuclear reactor, right? That's not what I'm talking about. I mean the philosophical school of pragmatism, which basically said the past has nothing to teach us. Ideology and philosophy are all these ruses created by old rich white men to secure their privilege, right? And the classic story of the American founders is that they were just a bit, they were the pale penis people who created these rules to protect rich white landowning, patriarchs of America, and that liberal democratic capitalism was just a con, right? This is something that kids are always taught, that all of the stuff, all of the principal bedrock assumptions of the American founding were really just a ruse to pull over on the poor and take land from people like Elizabeth Warren. And so, ever since then, the argument I make in the beginning of the book is that a lot of modern liberalism is indebted to this worldview. They believe they don't have an ideology, right? Jonathan Chait wrote a famous piece in the New Republic years ago called Fact Finders, in which he argued, and I'm not distorting this or exaggerating, you can look it up, he argued that if God himself came down to earth and told liberals that all of the empirical underpinnings, all of their assumptions about the free market and economics were completely wrong and conservatives were right, liberals would in a heartbeat give up all their positions and become free market, conservatives and libertarians. But conservatives, because we're so dogmatic and ideological, that even if God could prove to us that we were wrong, we would stay conservatives and free market guys because we're just so sort of brainwashed by our ideology. And he says, and he makes this argument. This argument was made by people like John Dewey, people like Barack Obama say it all the time. And Barack Obama says that we need a new Declaration of Independence from small-mindedness, bigotry, prejudice, and ideology. Right? He's not talking about his own ideology. He's talking about your ideology. Right? He doesn't think he has an ideology. He says he's a committed non-ideologue who only cares about what works. Right? And if you can look back on the last 4 years of his administration, with the cylinders all over the place, and spending his first year on Obamacare, and see the clear-eyed, sober, non-ideological pragmatist, well then, have another drink. And so in Chait's book, and in Chait's article, he uses an example, I'm just using this to sort of illustrate the point, he uses an example, he says, conservatives, this is before Obamacare obviously, he says, conservatives like to say we have the best healthcare system in the world. And of course they're idiots for thinking this. We actually have one of the worst healthcare systems in the world. In fact, the WHO, World Health Organization, has come out with a study that says that America comes in 37th in terms of its healthcare system. So this is the trick, right? It's got numbers, it's got math, but it's got to be real, right? It's a study with footnotes, so it's, and conservatives reject it. It's got a binder, and how stupid are conservatives for not, understanding, because this study, it's got facts, right? And so the problem with the study is if you actually go and look at it, it's like the worst study ever. And I know that sounds like hyperbole, and I know that sounds unusual coming from me, but so like, there's this guy James Atlas, right, who's the head of neuroradiology at Stanford University, and a fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he wrote a paper for Commentary Magazine. He wrote an article for Commentary Magazine about this WHO study a couple of years ago, and he calls it, I want to get the quote exactly right, the worst study ever. The trick of it was, what they did was, the study actually, 2/3 of your score for how good a healthcare system you have, according to the WHO study, was how financially fair the system is. Basically, it measured how it's paid for, how redistributionist it is. And they didn't even do the math of actually see how these systems are paid for. A big chunk of the survey was done by polling healthcare professionals at the World Health Organization. Fully half of the people who were what do they call it? Some term like fact finders or industry leaders or whatever it is. were bureaucrats at WHO. Now, some of these guys, maybe there's something you guys know, I don't know, and they're all like huge Milton Friedman fans, at WHO. But this is sort of the point, right? Here's this thing that they say is just sound science, hard facts, right? If you disagree with this, you hate science, right? And then you look at it, you look inside the Trojan horse, and you find out it's something completely different. It's this deeply ideological argument masquerading as this empirical, sound scientific endeavor. And the more you look around, the more you see this, is that this is the language that liberals adopt as a way to win arguments without actually having to have the arguments. And so one of the core arguments I make in the book is that liberals in fact have an ideology. And I say there's nothing wrong with having an ideology. An ideology, by my definition in the book, and I disagree with some conservatives on this, my definition in the book is simply that ideology is a checklist of your principles, a checklist of your priorities, right? Are you for expanding government, shrinking government? You want to expand individual liberty, you want to decrease individual liberty. Are you for free markets, or whatever it is? You can come up with 1,000 different questions, right? And there's no way to get around your principles. Now, you can be incoherent in how you think about your principles, you can be confused, you can be unself-aware, but you can't be without an ideology. And the problem that liberals have is because the first lie they tell is the lie they tell themselves when they say, I don't have an ideology, right? Because then it makes it possible for them to be very convincing when they tell other people this. And so it's really sort of hilarious. The first big interview I did for the book, I went on Piers Morgan's show. And, I feel bad being such a pain in the butt to Piers Morgan, but it's just the fastest route to his brain. So Piers has me on, right? And he clearly, and I'm not making this up, but this happens a lot in television. I'm not singling out for this. He clearly had no idea who I was, and he's looking at the book for the first time, and it's fine, he's never been cracked, whatever. He's like looking at the picture, looking at me, making sure I'm the same guy. It's all fine. TV hosts can't read every single book that comes their way. They would never get anything else done. I don't criticize him for that. But so he says, so what's your book about? And in not so many words, I say, well, I guess if I had to boil down to one thing, it's that liberals and conservatives, everybody has an ideology. The difference between conservatives and libertarians on one side and liberals on the other side is that conservatives and libertarians were honest about having an ideology, while liberals lie, first and foremost to themselves and then to the world, about not having it. And he goes, right, let's talk about the news of the day. And he sort of lights this incredible bonfire of asininity, right, where he keeps trying to beat me up over this Osama bin Laden ad. It was the first ad that Obama put out, where it was, what would Mitt Romney do? Because, Obama killed bin Laden. I don't know if you heard this, but Obama, he's so sort of reluctant to bring this up.
He himself killed him?
He did.
That's amazing.
In the cover of Night, he snuck out of the White House, and he personally garroted Osama bin Laden. The New York Times is going to leak that next week. But then he commences to carry water like Gunga Din for Obama, while at the same time saying over and over again, look, I don't have an agenda, I don't have an ideology, I just call them like I see them. I'm the straight shooter, you're the ideologue, you're the conservative, you've got this agenda. And it's amazing. All across the country, when I was doing the media tour stuff for this, all of these people would make my argument for me while they thought they were arguing with me. And so my favorite was when I was on the San Francisco NPR station. I'm there all the time. Whenever I visit San Francisco, I go to the office, they hey, Jonah, they high-five me. I'm like Norm from Cheers for this. So these, I have to say they were very polite, whatever, but then the callers start. And first caller, second caller, they keep making the same argument. They think, this is all very interesting, Mr. Goldberg, but, I think you just don't understand that liberals don't think the way you do. We don't think like an ideology. We don't think in ideological terms. We just want to do what's right. We just care about equality. And I'm like, okay, yeah. It's like you've read the book, right? And so like by the time the fourth person called in, he was really intense about it. I mean, you could almost hear his ponytail over the phone. And I was like, look, it's like I hired actors to call in to make my point for me. And so because because they think they don't have an ideology, what happens is that their ideology manifests itself in all of these cliches, right? One of the ones that really just sort of drives me crazy is this no label stuff, right? I mean, this is the perfect synthesis of it, right? You know, Michael Bloomberg, when he's not banning anything that's fun, poured a lot of money into this group called No Labels, right? And their self-described mission is declare war on labels, right? And you hear this all the time, you know, in politics. I've been following politics for a very long time, and it's always this trope that liberals use when they get into debates. They say, you bring up something that they don't like to hear, and say, enough with these labels, you know? I don't believe in labels, you know? You always hear Hillary Clinton or Al Gore would say in congressional testimony, you know, we need to move past these partisan differences. We need to get past these labels. I don't believe in labels. We get past this philosophical divide and just do the hard work the American people sent us here to do, right? This is their shtick, right? What you never hear them say is, we got to move beyond this partisan divide. We got to move beyond these ideological squabbles. And so therefore, for the sake of bipartisanship, I'm going to abandon all of my principles and agree with you. Right? They only ever say this when they want you to shut up and get with their program. That's the whole point of the shtick, right? But more sort of fundamentally, if you don't believe in labels, we have real problems, right? Because labels are another word for these things we call words. And we assign words to things to give them labels. Right? Without words, you know, words convey complex ideas, words convey notions of good and evil, words convey ideas like don't put your head in the microwave, you know, I mean, all sorts of like really important things, right? And if we give up on words, we're back in the trees. And if you don't think labels are important, I challenge you tonight when you go home, go into your kitchen, go under your sink, remove all the labels from your cleaning supplies, canned goods, and then, you know, just let nature take its course. But so anyway, so getting back to these college campuses, right? I mean, it would drive me crazy where these kids would say, you know, the one that I heard, I wouldn't say the most often, but probably drove me the most crazy was these kids would say, after I do this long talk on liberal fascism, some kid would say, Mr. Goldberg, I may disagree with what you have to say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And then they'd sit down. First of all, who gives a rat's ass? I've already had I gave my talk. I mean, you know, it's this way of sort of getting bravery on the cheap, right? It makes them sound like they're a better man than me. Like they're sort of implying that like I wouldn't risk my life for his right to free speech. But moreover, he's lying, right? I mean, really, some guy comes in with a gun, starts screaming, Goldberg! You know, this kid is going to be like, no! I don't believe him. But really, you know, the administrators and professors in the back of the room, they're all so proud of him, you know, like, oh, he's one of ours. You know, he's going to be David Gergen one day. And so it's like with the kid with, you know, violence never solves anything, right? I mean, if it's not an ideological statement, right? If it's not a statement of principle, if it's not a philosophical truism, right? If it's an actual empirical fact-finding statement of reality-based hoo-ha, whatever, right? Then you have to be too stupid to be a spell checker at an M&M factory to believe that violence never solved anything, right? I mean, violence and, you know, solve the problem with slavery, solve the problem with Hitler. You know, I mean, if violence ever solved anything, cops would see a crime like across the street, and they pull out their gun to stop someone from beating up an old lady, and they go over there, and then they look at their gun, and they go, damn, this thing's useless. And throw it away, because violence can't solve anything, right? And the reality is that violence solves all sorts of problems, particularly violent problems. And, you know, and violence in and of itself is not immoral. It depends what you do with it, right? William F. Buckley always used to use this great formulation about the moral equivalence during the Cold War. He would say, you know, we shouldn't get into the business of saying that one man who pushes old ladies in front of buses and another man who pushes old ladies out of the way of oncoming buses are both the sorts of men who push old ladies around, right? It depends what you're using violence for. And moreover, they don't mean it as a factual thing. They actually mean it as an ideological statement, even as they're sort of deriding me for making my ideological statement about how, you know, a strong national defense is a good idea. I can provide all sorts of excellent historical examples of why having a strong national defense is in our national interest, right? You can't find any really good examples of how violence never solved anything. And the reality is we get the phrase violence never solved anything. We get a little bit from Thoreau, who had his own problems, but we really get it from Gandhi. And it's really telling, right? Gandhi is this guy who popularized this idea that violence doesn't solve anything, right? But the reason why Gandhi became Gandhi was because he was using his philosophy in the British Empire. And whatever the faults of the British Empire are or were, they had fully formed consciences enough to be appealable through guilt, right? I mean, they were decent people. They may have gone too far, they had made mistakes. We can have an argument about the British Empire sometime. I'm sort of more sympathetic than most to it. But regardless, George Orwell is fascinating on this. He writes about Gandhi at great length. He says, look, if there are Gandhis in the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, we don't know who they are. Because the second you start doing passive resistance in a totalitarian regime, you get carted off in the middle of the night and sent to the gulag and killed. It's only in nations that are good and decent nations that shtick even works at all, right? And what's really telling is that Gandhi never said violence never solved anything to the Nazis. In fact, he called Hitler his friend. And his advice to the British was that they should his advice to the British was that they should surrender. He says, give up your islands, give up your beautiful homes, but keep your integrity, and just cave into the Nazis. His advice to the Jews was commit mass suicide. Now, last name's Goldberg. I don't find this the most adroit policy analysis. But whatever you think of it, don't tell me it's not an ideological position. Don't tell me he's not coming from an ideological standpoint. And when people in the West say violence never solves anything, almost invariably they use it to check decent people from stopping evil people. You know, we never heard anyone screaming at Saddam Hussein or Kim Jong-il, you know, hey, look, you know, violence never solved anything. You should stop putting people in wood chippers, right? They only say it to people in the West when they want to stop someone from putting people in wood chippers. And this is how it works. It's this Trojan horse way of making arguments, where you appeal to people's consciences, you appeal to things that everyone thinks are probably true but aren't. And the master of this these days, and certainly the most important practitioner of this art these days, is Barack Obama. And Barack Obama is a thoroughly cliched thinker. He's incredibly articulate and sometimes even eloquent if the teleprompter's working, elucidating and expressing these cliches, but the actual mindset that he comes from is profoundly cliche. And when I say cliche, you know, Orwell in Politics in the English Language, his 1946 essay, he basically is writing about the same thing. He doesn't use the word cliche. He uses, he's talking about euphemisms and dead metaphors and lazy thinking, but it's the same point. He says that these cliches, in effect, come to us like prefabricated hen houses and ended up doing our thinking for us. And when you listen to Barack Obama talk about this whole suite of issues around the idea of community and unity, about being our brother's keeper, about spreading the wealth around, he is deeply immersed in this sort of cult of unity about how politics should be organized. You know, one of the creepiest things I've seen in years is this Life of Julia thing, right? You know, the Obama campaign puts out this website. What's really telling is that the people in the Obama campaign, probably hundreds of people looked at this thing before they put it up on the web, and they all thought, this is awesome, right? And probably the creepiest sentence I've read in the last 10 years was this thing, you know, if you don't know what I'm talking about, Life of Julia is this hypothetical, what happens to this hypothetical young woman under, apparently, the tenure for life of Barack Obama, right? Because it tracks her life all the way to 2070. And at the end of her life, she gets to work in a community garden. She didn't get her own garden; she gets a community garden, right? And you know, she has a kid. She has a husband or she never has a husband, but she has a kid who just sort of disappears. Sort of when he turns 18, she never hears from him again. It's quite this thing, right? But the creepiest thing in it is it says, under Barack Obama, Julia decides to have a child. I don't know how many of, you know, there's some ladies in here have had kids, I've talked to them, and I don't know how many of you said, to yourself, under Jimmy Carter, I'm going to have a child. I really hope John Kerry becomes president, because then I will have a child. But this is sort of the political worldview that they see through, that people define their lives in relationship to the state. President Obama likes to say that if one American has a problem, we all have a problem. Right? Which, if that's true, then I want him to come to my house and fix my toilet. The reality is that part of being a free people is at least some of your problems are your problems, because you can't be happy unless you defeat your problems. But when you look at the way President Obama talks about, he says, I follow the biblical injunction to be our brother's keeper, to be our sister's keeper. Well, first of all, the phrase brother's keeper only shows up once in the entire Bible. And it's when one brother is trying to dodge a murder rap for killing his other. But it's this idea that somehow we're sort of all in it together, right? And when you listen to Democrats, not just, when you listen to liberals talk about unity, it's this idea that it's better to be wrong in a really big group than to be right alone, right? And someone like it. So now I can start drinking whiskey. And it's sort of, but this mindset suffuses these concepts of social justice, right? These concepts of community, and a lot like violence, right? Unity in and of itself is neither good nor bad. It depends what you use unity for, right? I love the old Little House on the Prairie. The little girl falls down a well. The Olsons and the Ingalls and everybody, they all drop what they're doing and they run and save the little girl down the well. That's beautiful stuff. I'm a sucker for that. I love that stuff, right? I love unity when, people all gather around to fight a flood and all that. That's all great stuff. But you know who else are unified? Rape gangs. The mafia. Lots of things are unified, right? Simply by virtue of being unified doesn't make them good. In fact, in our political tradition, we're very skeptical of unity. Read the Federalist Papers. Federalist 10, Federalist 51, right? It's all about pitting faction against faction, divided government, separation of powers. We have 3 branches of government, each of them vying to check the other one, checks and balances. We now have 50 state governments, each of them divided into legislative and executive branches, with judicial branches overseeing, and the federal. It's all about dividing things for fear of the dangers of unity. There is a political tradition that sees unity, strength in numbers, as a political good in and of itself. It's called fascism. Right? The symbol of fascism is a bundle of sticks around an axe. It means, literally, strength in numbers. In the American political tradition, the hero isn't the mob. It's the man who stands up against the mob and says, you're not going to lynch this man today. And so I said the overarching cliche that sort of binds sort of the progressive mindset is what I call the fundamental category error of politics. And it's basically this idea that government can love you, right? And the problem is government cannot love you. Government cannot fill up that hole in your soul. It cannot give you that feeling that you had with your family when you were younger, or that feeling you felt that you should have had from your family. It cannot be your church or your synagogue. It can only be government. And this is why I cannot stand these cliches like, we need to dedicate ourselves to a cause larger than ourselves. Right? The only person I've ever heard of who's not dedicated to a cause larger than themselves is Hannibal Lecter. Right? Everybody is dedicated to a cause. Your family, I take a bullet for my daughter in a heartbeat. Your family, your businesses, your communities, your churches, your synagogues, your bowling leagues, your friends, the conservative movement, places like the Heartland Institute. These are all causes larger than yourself, but they aren't defined in terms of relationship to government. They aren't defined in a way that makes, under President Obama, I decided to have a child make sense, right? And this is the fundamental problem, is that there are these people who believe, if we all just work our hardest and try our best, we can make this the best yearbook ever. And they think they can apply that to government. And you can't. Government cannot love you. It can only be government. You can do some things okay, a lot of things mediocre, and a vast number of things horrible. And so the long-lasting lesson from this is simply that, I get from people all the time, especially when I talk to sort of stodgy conservative audiences. You'll get some guy who's been writing generous checks to the conservative movement for 50 years, and he wants some payback now. I mean, he's like, how are we going to fix this? How are we going to solve that? And the short answer is, we're not, right? Because at the end of the day, there are always going to be people on the other side who are confused about politics. There are always going to be on the other side who are going to think that if government can just get a little more data, or we get a few more PhDs in the room, all of a sudden government can solve it. And I write about this in my book. I say, the fundamental argument of the 20th, now the 21st century, isn't between Hayek and John Maynard Keynes. It's a really boring argument to me. This thing about monetary policies. It's a math argument. I didn't do well in math. The interesting argument of the 20th century, the central argument of the 20th century, is between Friedrich Hayek and John Dewey. John Dewey was the pragmatist philosopher who believed that individuals could be smart enough to figure out everything. That if you just give some planner enough data, enough information, he can figure out what the right price of something is. And Hayek is the guy who says, you're higher than a moonbat. It's impossible. There's this thing called the knowledge problem. There are always going to be too many variables, too much stuff you cannot know. And that's why you have to rely on prices to send signals for what things are worth. Because even the people who are selling you something, they don't know all the information that goes into the price of something. Prices are incredibly complex things, right? My favorite essay in the history of libertarianism is an essay called I, Pencil, by a guy named Leonard Read. Came out in 1959, I think, or 61. It's written from the perspective of the pencil. And it says, I am an Eberhard Faber pencil number 2, blah, blah, blah. And he goes on and he explains that nobody in the world knows how to make a pencil. The guy who sells pencils or manufactures pencils, he knows how to put the last 1% of the ingredients together. He's the guy who sticks on the little tin thing at the top, puts the rubber in it, and puts the paint on it. He doesn't know how to make the paint, doesn't know how to forge the tin, doesn't know how to synthesize the rubber, doesn't know how to mine the graphite or whatever the hell's in pencils. There was a guy at the British Museum a few years ago who made a toaster from scratch. It took him 8 years. It was a really shitty toaster. And so, this is the point I'm getting at. Capitalism and free markets are the most cooperative, wonderful system ever created for collective, peaceful, harmonized cooperation. The problem is it's so good at it, it doesn't feel like it. And so there are all these people who are looking to get out of government what they think they're missing in life, right? Because millions of people from all around the world are chopping down trees, they're synthesizing paint, they're distilling chemicals, and they make pencils for less than a penny a piece. All working cooperatively and peacefully, all making a living from doing so. And no one's telling them to do it, right? No one's telling them, okay, this is going to be a pencil. They're each doing their part, but they're all working together all around the world speaking different languages. Government wants to come in and do what markets do much, much worse in order to give people meaning in their lives. And it's really, really bad at it. And the job for people like us is to explain to people like them why they're wrong. And either the depressing or the fun part about it, for me it's fun because I like to have arguments, is that you're going to be doing this for the rest of your lives. And the good news is that you're on the good side of the good fight. You are fighting for the good cause, you're fighting for the only anti-poverty program ever proven to work, which is the free market. So you should be proud of it, enjoy it, and just go into the trenches every day being happy warriors. And if you can't do it yourself, give money to places like the Heartland Institute and they'll do it for you. Thank you all very much.